Hey everybody, welcome to my comic diary. I'm Brad, and today we're going to review The Center Holds #1 from Boom Studios. Artist M.D. Bright finished this series with writer Larry Hama shortly before Bright passed in 2024. Boom Studios is releasing the book now, and partial proceeds from the sales are going to the Hero Initiative in Bright's honor. Both these artists hold a lot of nostalgia for me from their work on G.I. Joe when I was a kid. This was a foundational book for me. But was that nostalgia enough with The Center Holds, or was I one and done? The creative team for The Center Holds includes writer Larry Hama, who obviously had the legendary and ongoing run at G.I. Joe from the Marvel days through the current Image and Skybound books. He also had the long run on Wolverine. M.D. Bright's the artist. He worked on G.I. Joe when I was a kid. I didn't realize he actually worked on Armor Wars when that storyline came out, and also was a co-creator of Quantum and Woody for Valiant. Josh Burcham is the colorist, and Janice Chang is the letterer. These creators defined a huge chunk of my childhood. Larry Hama's run on G.I. Joe starting in the 80s, even though I know it's going on today with the Image books. Back in the 80s, it was my first Marvel comic. It was a subscription that my grandmother got me. I was heavy into the action figures, but those books were so dense and complex. They had subplots that ran over several issues. All the characters had their own personalities. Even though he was bringing in new characters from the toy line every few issues, they all had their own personality. The relationships between the characters were unique. And it just didn't feel like a comic for kids to me at the time. And M.D. Bright did a bunch of those issues, mostly in the 80s and 90s numbered issues. So going into The Center Holds, I had to ask myself, am I going to like this because it's good, or because it's Larry Hama and M.D. Bright and I'm going to have a lot of nostalgia for it and I'm going to feel like I'm 12 years old again? The premise of the book, it takes place in a future Earth or an alternate Earth. It's hard to tell. They mention things like United Korea and Nueva Pacifica, which I think is supposed to be the West Coast. And so it's definitely not our Earth. There's wind turbines on all these futuristic looking buildings. The superheroes, there's a number of superheroes, and they all function within a realistic framework. You know, they're worried about insurance, collateral damage, PR, having to get an operating license so they can even be a superhero. And there's a group called the Union of Superheroes, which helps manage all that, coordinates their superhero efforts, but also like worries about their insurance premiums, their finances, how they're going to set up trust funds for the younger members, things like that. It has that real world sensibility like a Watchmen or an Astro City. I'm not saying it's as unique or as good as those comics, but it still has that kind of sense of reality about it. It's not a completely fictional universe. So let's take a look at some of the pages in the book, and I can show some of my highlights and lowlights. Okay, diving into the book. The cover I like the composition, I like the color dynamics. The only thing I have an issue with is this doesn't happen in the book. We don't even know who this villain in the middle is, or this guy in the background. None of this happens. So it's a little confusing in that it almost seems like the cover for a later book. But other than that, I like it. It's an engaging cover. Going to the first page, the opening scene is all about world establishment, and it works through these first few pages. The book drops you straight into the world. There's no origin story, no setup issue. There's a narrator voice running through the whole book discussing the nature of altruism and human nature. We'll come back to that, but just that starts right off the bat. You see differing reactions from civilians. Some of them like the heroes, some of them don't love the collateral damage that comes with them. And then the first scenes lead into a bank robbery by a man in an elephant mask named Mr. Wright, who talks about class warfare, and there seem to be political overtones that are present throughout this battle that kind of set up a right versus center or a right versus left dynamic. It borders on parody because of the language of Mr. Wright. He just really says some kind of silly things. I didn't mind it. Others might have more of an issue, but I think Hama's just trying to have fun. Most of the page layouts are pretty straightforward. You know, you've got panels that are full bleed and others that are bordered and some overlap, but for the most part they're pretty rectilinear and straightforward. The fight with Mr. Wright has a couple pages that have more dynamic panel layouts, but in general it's a more traditional approach. When the Keeper comes on the scene, you get some classic Larry Hama text. There's talk of a 5th generation wire-guided anti-tank missile and depleted uranium penetrator rounds, stuff like that, that is just classic G.I. Joe Hama dialogue that, if you grew up reading this stuff, it hits deep. Following the battle with Mr. Right, we go to a meeting of the Union of Superheroes. Hero age ranges from 10 to ancient. There's mention of some of the heroes, specifically Apex, who seems to be a Superman analog of not aging at all. And they're talking, like much of the book, they're talking about realistic financial matters, talking about insurance premiums. There's a lot of that throughout the whole book. On this page, we see the captions from the narrator again. If I live another 30,000 years, I will never understand these humans. And you see Apex aside from the others watching them. You start to realize, oh, Apex is the narrator. He's the one talking about altruism and human nature, which makes you think, okay, he's an alien or has some other secret background. You have setting up relationships. There's like 6 subplots that he sets up here towards the end of the book. Pretty seamlessly. All of it makes sense. The final scene takes place in an underground silo prison. It gives serious G.I. Joe pit vibes. They don't have capital punishment, but the heroes can choose between being in cryogenic stasis or restraints that sound borderline tortuous. And the restraints have strong Kirby, New Gods, Eternals type vibes, which is pretty cool. It raises moral questions about how these supervillains are imprisoned. It doesn't try and answer anything yet, and maybe that's something they're going to work on going forward. And then you see this red guy down here. I'm assuming he's the red guy on the cover in future issues, but so far, this is all we see of him. Looking at the book as a whole, the art is classic MD Bright. It's very energetic, it's readable, it's easy to follow. It is a little traditional in its panel layout for the most part. There's not a lot of experimentation going on. So on some of the slower scenes where there's not a lot of action taking place, it can be a little dry. A lot of the shots are kind of medium shots. There's not dynamic camera angles to try and add some energy to some of those pages with a lot of text and conversation going on. But the action scenes are good. They read exactly as you would want them to in kind of a classic style. Looking at the story and art together, this book is the opposite of White Sky that we reviewed last week. That book was super decompressed to the point where there wasn't a lot of story going on. It was all just kind of ambient mood setting. The Center Holds is a very dense book. There's a lot of world building, a lot of character development. The amount of text that Hama is trying to get on the page sometimes can hinder the panel layouts, which I think led to a lot of more traditional, less exciting pages when there's no action going on. But to me, it reads as someone who grew up reading vintage books that have a lot more text on the page, this reads like a vintage book with modern sensibilities grafted onto it. To somebody who is younger than me and grew up with more decompressed comics, I could see them thinking that this is a lot of text, a lot of exposition, and might be a little overwhelming. So my verdict, just as a reminder, I don't usually buy indie books month to month. I buy the number one, and from that, decide whether or not to get the trade paperback when it comes out so I can get the rest of the story. So for the Center Holds, was this nostalgia enough, or am I one and done? I'm going to wait for the trade. I thought this book was a lot of fun. It had a lot of nostalgia and old school energy that I really dug. There's a lot there. I think it's a 5 or 6 issue limited series because that's how much Bright had done before he passed. If Hama wants to move forward with another artist, there's plenty of meat on the bone to make a meal of. The world is interesting. The mysteries are intriguing. And I think Bright's final work deserves to be seen. On top of that, 2% of net sales going to the Hero Initiative. That's worth something too. So please like and subscribe. And more than anything, please comment. The goal of the channel is to get a community together that can talk comics. And until then, be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time.